Sean Penn was there. Sean lives in Malibu, and he didn't know if his house had burned down. I didn't know if mine house had burned down. We're all evacuated. And I said, Sean, is this the world that we're going to live in? Is there anything that actually can be done? These fires are going to come all the time. Is there anything that we can do? And he said, in a typical Sean fashion, you shut the fuck up. You shut the fuck up. You're a father, and you don't have the luxury as a father of going down that road. You are going to fight. You know, that's my view is, sure, you could curl up in the fetal position and suck your thumb and say it's all too late. I'm just going to enjoy my life. That's just a big excuse. It's up to all of us if we want to fight.
The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. Joining me as always is the real estate oracle of Omaha, Chris Pomerleau, self-proclaimed Adam Newman of Green Building, Owen Barrett, and of course I am the world's greatest climate podcast host, Joel Caesar. Today we're speaking to Trevor Neilson. He's the CEO and co-founder of WasteFuel. Man, we had a high energy, wide-ranging, authentic, raw conversation. Trevor is a wealth of knowledge, tremendous experience in impact investing. I have to say, his message of, dude, just start doing it. Fucking take action. We don't have the luxury of waiting. I think coming from him, someone who's out there on the front lines, taking action, investing, starting companies that need to exist, it's really refreshing.
Yeah. I want to be like Trevor when I grow up. And I'm going to do everything in my power to go get drunk with him in Malibu in the next month.
I think what resonated for me was not only leaning into it, like you said, Joel, but just opening your mind to seeing things from different angles. I mean, he's like, look, these climate change issues are going to affect everybody, both sides of the aisle, and you got to understand how they're going to affect everybody if you actually want to accomplish something, instead of drawing that line in the sand and just not listening to any headwind when it comes to climate change. And that was huge for me to hear him say that, because it really is the only way we're going to accomplish anything is to understand how it affects everybody. So I love what he had to say about that.
Well, we enjoyed our conversation with Trevor, but before we get to that, let's dive into a segment we're calling Is That Tweet For Real? So Twitter handle, a gentleman named Brian Gitt. He's someone who tweets a lot about energy. He's very pro-nuclear, sometimes takes a controversial, adversarial stance, as we would on renewables. So Brian, when you hear this, we hope we can get you on the show at some point. But the tweet we want to reference today, he says, capturing carbon from the air, not from a power plant or factory smokestack, is called direct air capture. CO2 is only 0.04% of the air. And he says, using machines to suck CO2 out of the air makes about as much sense as using a straw to suck seawater out of the ocean. So we're talking about direct air capture technology that's gaining a ton of popularity and a lot of investment opportunity to do exactly what he describes. Suck the global warming, climate change creating carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Probably a lot of directions we can go on this tweet. Oh, and why don't you kick us off? What are your thoughts?
Man, as usual, I have mixed emotions here. At the most basic level, I agree with the technology. I think we're going to need it to hit the targets we need to prevent catastrophe. But did either of you guys watch the 2016 Super Bowl? And do you remember who played in it?
I'm sure I did. I probably lost money gambling on it.
Well, who played in it is not important. I don't even remember. What I do remember is there was a commercial about a new prescription drug to solve opioid-induced constipation. And I think carbon capture is kind of like that prescription, in that we're not treating the cause, the root cause of the problem. Why don't doctors stop prescribing so many opioids? Why don't we figure out how to regulate that? Is very similar to why don't we figure out how to stop building terrible buildings, how to decarbonize existing buildings, how to improve energy efficiency and renewable energy, instead of coming up with all these crazy solutions that are sort of more pie in the sky. So again, as always, I'm split in my opinion, but I don't think we should put too much focus on it, because I don't think it gets at the root of the problem.
Yeah, I don't know how to say that better, Joel. I mean, first off, it's hard to back up the analogy of a constipation drug, but Yeah, it seems to me like a last straw thing. And look, there are a lot of smart people who are a part of these things. So hopefully there's some good intentions there. But, during the podcast, we're talking about restructuring the way companies throughout the world are transferring their material and how that could take a huge chunk out of CO2 emissions. Well, that research and development seems a lot more along the lines of making a gigantic change as opposed to continue as usual. We're just going to try to build these multi-billion dollar machines that just kind of soak up a sliver of what you're doing, and what you're doing is wrong. So to me, it seems like kind of a last ditch effort, and I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a lot of room to actually make some gigantic gains now at the start of this, before the constipation starts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll agree with everyone here, and even Brian's tweet. Does it make sense to suck CO2 out of the air? I think if you believe the climate models that experts project are accurate, which we do, it seems inevitable that if we really want to prevent catastrophic warming, that we're going to have to find ways to pull CO2 out of the air. Now, I think we can all agree nature-based solutions will be better. There's a ton of co-benefits than building these high energy intensive machines to suck CO2 out of the air. But there's examples of this happening in Iceland where it's completely powered by local geothermal. So it's, you'd argue, carbon-free energy to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. That's maybe a good thing. But I come back to agree with Owen. I think it's just in line with who we are as a company and what we're trying to say on this podcast is that we have technology and the resources and the business models available to decarbonize our economy right now. And that's where our focus should be entirely.
I think you did a better job explaining it without the constipation analogy.
No, you got to add a little flavor in there.
Now, here's our conversation with Trevor Neilson. Trevor Neilson is the co-founder and CEO of WasteFuel, a company that produces sustainable fuels through the conversion of municipal and agricultural waste. Focused on building and scaling impactful companies, Trevor is dedicated to making a difference in the fight against climate change. With a diverse career spanning business, philanthropy, and social change, at his core, he is a climate rebel. We're excited to welcome Trevor Neilson to the Climate Rebels podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We like to get right to work. We start every guest with the same question. How are you, a climate rebel?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define rebellion. I mean, if rebellion is believing that we don't have to just accept this terrifying, slow, yet fast trajectory and assume that our children and their children are going to live at a terrifying, inhospitable, dangerous world, I guess it's just standing up and saying something actually can be done, and that kind of tragic momentum doesn't have to be our destiny. So, I think in my case, I'm just somebody that wants to use the time that I have and the resources that I have to try to fight back a little, and I guess rebel against the notion that that's inevitable. And I don't think it's inevitable, but I think it's getting harder and harder. But I guess the concept of rebellion is actually one that I'm drawn to because I think that it indicates a desire to change the trend line, which is pretty scary at this point. I kind of come at this in multiple different ways because I founded a finance company previously with Howard Buffett. It's called IX Net Zero that IPO'd in London a couple of years ago. That's investing in climate solutions, sustainable transition. And then my current company, WasteFuel, where we're taking garbage and turning it into low carbon fuels. The scale of the challenge becomes very clear once you start trying to build the very infrastructure that is necessary to decarbonize. Because decarbonization isn't really about paper straws versus plastic straws or about taking one less flight a year or having meatless Mondays or buying a handbag made of mushrooms instead of cow leather. All of those things are great and are virtuous, of course, but ultimately what we have to change is our energy system, and in particular, the fuels that power our world and the power that we use on our grids. The price of that infrastructure and the difficulty of that infrastructure and the execution of that infrastructure, the working with the finance community, who I completely agree is saying that they want to lead this transition, but in their actions is wildly complicated. And it actually makes the political rhetoric and the activist rhetoric, which I've also been involved with by starting the Climate Emergency Fund and funding the activist groups, it makes all of that look sort of cute. Like, we demand decarbonization, right? We're going to protest. We demand that we decarbonize. And government officials go, oh, okay, well, yes, I agree that we should decarbonize. And the activists go, yeah, the government officials agree. Actually, what has to happen is we have to change the molecules. What molecules are we actually burning? Where are the molecules coming from? What's the life cycle analysis of the production of the power or the fuels or whatever it is that you're using? So there's a lot of political theater that's kind of the easy part. The whole game is actually transitioning our entire energy infrastructure. We're not going to chip away at 418 parts per million of CO2 without that shift. And I don't think that there's a lot of seriousness about that conversation. So that's what I mean by hard. We're right in the middle of this, trying to build these biorefineries, which is wildly complicated, even with a very talented team of chemical engineers and process engineers, industrial engineers. We've got a big Houston office. Everybody's former oil and gas, by the way, every one of them. People that now want to use the same skills that got us into this problem to get us out of this problem. Wildly complicated. And I think that a lot of people, and probably some people that watch this podcast, listen to this podcast, think more about the political side of the issue and the public messaging around the issue and think less about infrastructure.
Trevor, you're my new favorite guest.
Yeah.
You're much more accomplished than I am, a lot smarter than I am, and you're validating everything I've been saying the last 10 years. So thank you for coming on.
Trevor, you probably are, but I want you to know it doesn't take much to be smarter than I.
Good. Just 1% more.
That's all it takes.
Nobody really realizes how complicated it is. And I think you see a lot of stuff, for example, up north in the valley, climate-focused companies of various kinds, and I'm not going to pick on anybody in particular, that are kind of hammering away at this like tiny piece of the puzzle that honestly doesn't really matter when it comes to decarbonization. Like I would call that climate tech cute. Climate tech cute is we're going to help a big company account for its carbon emissions more carefully at the end of the year, something like that. We've got an enterprise software we're going to sell into somebody that allows them to
The perfect guest.
right? Virtuous, but not very real, if that makes sense.
Yeah. One of our favorite statistics is that, I don't know, over the last time frame, let's call it 5 years, VCs have invested 10x more money into carbon accounting software than they have technologies that actually reduce carbon.
Please tell me that's not true. But I'm
No,
sure that it is.
it's 100% true.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm an LP in a couple of venture funds, and I won't name names, but one of them actually called me the other day because he wanted one of the GPs wanted a point of view on a company that's looking at using methane from oil and gas to power data centers. Right? Perfectly reasonable. You capture that methane, it can create power, and then data centers or Bitcoin miners or whatever are then drawing from a renewable resource, although in that case it isn't really because it's fossil driven, but at least that methane's not being flared or it's not being put into the atmosphere. Anyway, I gave him a point of view on the whole thing, and he said to me, oh, good, because thank you for doing this, because I'm trying to convince my other partners that we should be doing more on climate. In his case, he's pushing 60 years old. He's been investing in e-commerce and fashion tech and whatever for a long time. And he wants to do something, but he feels as if they don't have the subject matter expertise to do it. And I said to him, dude, just start doing it. If you need to call on external resources or get somebody's point of view that knows something about power generation or methane or whatever, just figure it out, but just start doing it. And don't use the excuse of, actually, I heard Scott Galloway talking about this on his podcast, that he doesn't have this domain expertise to really talk about climate change. Well, what an absurd thing to say. He's a super smart guy. He knows all about entrepreneurship. And so we all have to decide that we either are subject matter experts or we're just going to fucking figure it out because it's an emergency. When your house is on fire, you don't wait because you're not a firefighting expert. You try to put the fire out. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Trevor, all things we totally agree with. I mean, we're fans of yours on LinkedIn. You often post about your skepticism of corporate climate commitments, your agreement with hit pieces about net zero commitments. We want to talk about IX net zero. I don't know if you recall, we talked to you years ago about one of our ventures.
I remember.
Maybe getting some support. So we can go there in a bit. But your accomplished career, all these different ways you're affecting the movement. You mentioned entrepreneurship and being a doer. Things we definitely are here to celebrate. How did you get to this venture, WasteFuel, what you're focusing on right now? That probably was a big decision, right? You can put your time and effort into lots of things to fight this crisis. What was unique? What was special about this opportunity that you decided to put your full weight behind it?
Can you also just give a little background on WasteFuel? We're all experts as we've done our homework, but not everyone will be.
Yeah, so WasteFuel is using proven technologies to take the organic fraction, the organic part of landfill waste, also called municipal waste, and turn it into low carbon fuels. And in our case, we were turning it primarily into biomethanol. And so biomethanol we sort of made a bet that biomethanol was going to become the future fuel for global shipping. And actually, there's an amazing story, which is one of these stories that proves the adage of it's better to be lucky than smart, which is good in my case, in that we made this bet in part based on advice from our president, Mario De La Osa, that biomethanol should be our focus. And I sent a cold LinkedIn message to Maersk, at the time the world's biggest shipping company. Now it's the second biggest shipping company. And I said, like, dear Maersk, or person at Maersk who I've never spoken to in my life, like one of those like LinkedIn, like whatever it's called, where you don't know the person, but you're still allowed to email them like twice a month or something. InMail, I think that's what it's called, right? Like you're like, you get a couple of them, but not many, right? So I said to them, hey, we're going to be producing biomethanol. We know you've been talking about the need to decarbonize shipping. If you decide that methanol is where you're heading, instead of ammonia or hydrogen. So the big debate for years in shipping is going to be, or LNG, but most people agree that's not really decarbonizing. Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be ammonia? Or is it going to be methanol? We made a bet on methanol. We reached out to Maersk. They wrote back to me, their global head of decarbonization, Morten Bo Christensen, wrote back to me in like 4 minutes. It was like 1 a.m. in Copenhagen. And he was like, we need to talk. And I thought, oh shit, did I do something wrong? And anyway, we got on the phone and it turned out they were about to announce their first orders of methanol powered ships. So Maersk has been a real leader in this. And then following that, all of the major shipping companies, including CMA, which is a big French carrier, announced another, I think, 8 or 10 new ships. Shipping is going to methanol. And that was the bet we had made. All methanol this is actually quite simple for people that are not super technical. All we're doing is capturing the methane that would have emitted into the air, into the atmosphere, and turning it into a fuel to replace fossil. So on a life cycle analysis, we get to something like a 95% reduction in greenhouse gases versus fossil fuels. And life cycle analysis is how you have to look at these things. We also have no NOx, no SOx. These are other nasty particulates that bunker fuels, which is what shipping companies currently use. The dirtiest fuels on the planet, by the way. Getting rid of that stuff has all sorts of crazy benefits, and we're addressing the global waste crisis. So the shocking statistic about waste is it's going like this. There's going to be 2.5 billion tons a year of municipal waste by 2040. 2.5 billion tons a year. And as countries around the world get wealthier, actually, they produce more waste. We figure, why not use that as fuel? Thus, the name of the company. WasteFuel.
Are you guys utilizing landfills and capturing methane that way, or are you diverting waste to a different stream entirely?
So great question. So we have to use new waste. So we can't really use the old waste that's in a landfill. Why? Because the energy content of that waste, remember, we're talking about the organic fraction of the waste, and I'll explain to you why we're not using the plastics if you're interested. But the organics start decomposing and start emitting methane as soon as they hit the landfill. In fact, they actually are emitting it on their way to the landfill too. So we want to get that fresh waste as fast as we can. We put it then into a process called anaerobic digestion, which has been around for a very long time. This is how pretty much all renewable natural gas operations work. There is a tank. Anaerobic basically means you're depriving it of oxygen, and then you're letting bugs do their work. These are enzymes, basically. There's things called catalytic enzymes that can kind of increase the yield of the gas. And then we do have some proprietary technology on the back end that then turns that gas into a liquid fuel. We call that the WasteFuel methanol module. So we're practical. We think, well, instead of that methane going into the air, by the way, methane is, as you guys know, depending upon who you ask, 70 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide in the early years. Methane is really a weapon of mass destruction in the world of climate.
That's the whole cow fart argument.
Burps, farts, landfill, and oil and gas infrastructure. And by burps and farts, I'm not talking about yours, Chris. I'm talking about the cows.
I mean, when I have some Mexican, I've been Mexican food.
We might be able to harness that gas, but that would be a different business line. So we'll have to take that offline. The CapEx and the OpEx of that could be complicated, supply chain issues and such. No, but the basic idea is that let's not let that gas go into the atmosphere. Let's capture it. On the cattle side of things, you actually have to address the cattle's diets. There's some companies that are out there trying to do that with various supplements and such that make the digestive tract more.
Maybe seaweed, right?
Yeah, there's garlic approaches, there's seaweed approaches.
How big are these anaerobic digestors, and can they be scaled down to like restaurant level?
So not with a profitable business model is the answer. Food waste, by the way, is the vast majority of the organic fraction of landfill waste. I've been to landfills all over the world. And when you're talking about the organics, you're basically talking about food waste, lawn clippings, restaurants, and scaping services are huge drivers of that organic waste. There are some cardboards and papers that we can also use in our process. The reason we don't use the plastics, like the single-use plastics, is not because we can't, because we can turn that into fuel. It's because the shipping companies don't want to buy it, because it's fossil based. And that's going to have to actually change. So for example, if you look at Maersk is farther along than the other shipping companies on this stuff. Maersk future fuel policy prohibits the use of fossil at all, right? We could actually have a friendly debate about that probably, because I could say that it's actually better to use those single-use plastics, which are just half of the landfill is, single-use plastics, basically. A bunch of other stuff too. But yeah, you want to meet their fuel policies, right? Because if you don't meet their fuel policies, that they can't buy it. Now, going to net zero overall, 90% of consumer products move on a ship. 90% of consumer products move on a ship. Companies that deal with consumer products cannot make net zero commitments. There are 3,000 companies that have made science-based net zero commitments. Yeah. And yet very few of them have any credibility associated with what are called scope 3 emissions, which is the transport of these products. Why? These fuels haven't existed. So we're trying to solve a huge piece of the corporate net zero commitment problem, the transport problem. It all really comes down to the fuels and to the ships and the engines, but the shipping companies are doing their part by ordering these ships. It's pretty astounding, actually, that tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of new ship orders that have already occurred, and the fuels aren't even really available yet. So we announced that our project in Dubai that's going to hopefully break ground during the COP summit there in December, that'll be the first commercial scale facility in the world converting municipal waste into biomethanol for shipping.
Why Dubai? Is that just how everything came together, or did you guys pick it strategically?
Both. A partnership with an incredible waste owner called Averda, and this is all publicly announced. Averda is the leading waste manager in the region, led by a CEO who's just top-notch, a great partner for us. Dubai is super important in terms of global shipping routes. Things move fast in the UAE in terms of permitting, in terms of the business environment overall. Building one of these things in California would probably take a decade. Building one of these things there is a much faster process. So anyway, that'll be the first, but we need these things all over the world. They need to be co-located with landfills or near landfills, but ideally they're right there, right? So the trucks come in and the waste gets separated. Some of it can be recycled out, hopefully. Some of it, if it has to be, could be incinerated, which is what most cities are doing, which is terribly inefficient and something that pretty much shouldn't be happening anymore. But back to the question about how I got to WasteFuel. So about 10 years ago, I made a decision that as an entrepreneur, philanthropically, politically, I really only wanted to focus on the climate emergency. I've worked on a lot of different things. I worked for Bill Gates for a long time. I worked on global health issues, a bunch of different African related things. But I made that decision, and then the decision was reinforced when the Woolsey fire came to Southern California and burned down 1,000 houses in the mountains where I live. I live in in Malibu in the mountains. Terrifying. Our house did not burn down, but many of our friends' houses did. We were evacuated for 3 weeks. There was a period of time where I couldn't reach my family because the phone lines were down. I didn't know where they were. We didn't know where the fire was, because even our present era, there's no good mapping system online for wildfires, which is insane. So I was literally running through JFK Airport. I had a board meeting in New York, running to get on the first plane, looking at the CNN monitors to try to spot if my house had burned down or was about to burn. Well, I couldn't reach my family. So after that, I kind of turned it up a notch, I guess, both with IX Net Zero and then eventually with WasteFuel. WasteFuel had been a portfolio company of IX Net Zero. So we had made a very early investment in it. I had helped co-found it, but I was still running that investing company, and then decided to take over because I thought the scale of the opportunity was such. And also IX was going to IPO, and I didn't want to be the CEO of a publicly traded company. So that's how I got there.
Fascinating stuff, Trevor. And thank you for the work you're doing there. I'd love to get back to IX Net Zero. If you watch the trailer to this podcast, you hear a quote from Owen Barrett saying, impact investors are full of shit. Here we are talking to a very decorated impact investor. We like to keep it real here on the Climate Rebels podcast. Owen, do you want to clarify that statement before we ask Trevor for his rebuttal?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Trevor, I know when we connected originally, it was via Z&E Capital. The whole premise was buying existing buildings, decarbonizing them. Similar to your story with WasteFuel, we've landed on existing buildings as the thing that we want to focus on in the battle against climate change. And when I looked at sort of the return profiles and the risk profile of decarbonizing existing occupied cash flowing real estate, it seemed like the most obvious impact investing opportunity. So we spent 3 years pitching institutional impact investors, and it was a sad 3 years between climate investors not understanding real estate investors not understanding climate, and or just the expected returns of these supposed impact investors being 20 plus IRRs. The whole industry just seemed inauthentic. And it really put a bad taste in my mouth for groups that are calling themselves impact investors, talking a lot, but not walking very much.
I couldn't agree more. And the problem is a problem of risk tolerance and of the return profile that not just institutional investors, but also family offices, high net worth folks, and more often their staff, what their expectation is of risk and return, I think is a huge part of the problem. And all of the institutional investors, let's not name names. Some of these folks perhaps might be involved in what we're doing, but let's just say you're some anonymous pension fund, right? And your CEO has gone to Davos or whatever and has made a commitment that they're going to use X percentage of the fund to invest in decarbonization projects because they think it's the right thing to do. And maybe the public employees, for example, that you represent are saying to you, this matters to us, right? But then when it comes to the staff themselves, there's an insane risk aversion, insane. And this incredible chicken and egg where they're more than happy to invest once something has been completely de-risked. But until it's completely de-risked, they're going to sit around and tell you all of the reasons why there's risk. And these are people with fancy MBAs and technical degrees and you name it, whose sole job is to point out all the problems with your impact strategy or your decarbonization strategy, whatever it may be. And I've been in hundreds of these meetings, right? Now, with IX Net Zero, the thesis there, and when Howard and I created, Howard is Warren's grandson, this Howard Warren Buffett. It gets a little confusing, but really bright guy, professor at Columbia University. The whole thesis was that the world's biggest problems are also the biggest investment opportunities. And in that case, we initially aggregated about 70 family offices and high net worth individuals as the initial capital for IX, with the belief that family offices and high net worth individuals are going to act faster. They're going to be more liquid, more entrepreneurial, have more of a risk tolerance. And it was true, actually. And I think that is true today, that certain family offices don't have some of the brutal sort of return needs that institutional investors have. But it is a major problem in the space. I mean, again, not naming names, I was in London a couple of weeks ago, and I sat with an institutional investor that has branded themselves as sort of the most, I guess, aggressive on climate institutional fund. Let's just leave it at that. Like that's their DNA, is that they're the people that really care, right? But when it really came down to it, the MBA/chem engineer guy sitting across from the table with us pretty much told us that unless what we were doing was completely de-risked, at which point we don't even need them, by the way, they couldn't invest because it didn't meet their expectation. They want revenue, right? By the time there's revenue, you don't need them. Yeah. So there is this incredible sort of chicken and egg problem with the investment community. And really, I think it requires leadership. Somebody has to step up and say, this is a global emergency. We are going to start behaving in a different way. We're not going to forsake returns because we all know there's incredible returns to be had in this space. But we're not going to be so dumb about how we do the analysis. If you're 6 months from revenue, We're not going to tell you we only invest post-revenue. Because if you're 6 months from revenue, we could probably handle that 6-month period as a risk factor. There's a lot of this kind of bucket thinking, this siloed thinking. And we've got to get through it if we're going to solve this problem, because at the end of the day, equity and debt and infrastructure is what's going to drive a sustainable transition. And without equity, debt, talented infrastructure people, we're not going to do it. And the politics, what's happening in Congress matters and it doesn't matter. Sure, it's wonderful that we have the IRA and you've got the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. That is an incentive for climate investing, at least in the US. We're seeing that now. That's a positive thing. But even so, even with that sort of enabling environment, you still need the investment community in order to make this transition.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of BS and we need some bravery on the part of people. We need people to be brave and actually not just think about quarterly results or are they going to return a 22% IRR or a 29% IRR, right? They're going to have to think about society, their children, their grandchildren. In the case of like pension funds, they're going to have to think about the actual pensioners, the people that they represent. What are their lives like? And I don't think we're seeing a lot of that right now.
Well, it's a big reason we're doing this podcast. Trevor, we're trying to shed light, and maybe educate is not the right word, but just bring awareness to this disconnect between what people, companies, major influential organizations are saying and what we experience, and celebrate people who are taking action. I think, what did you say? Dude, just start doing it. That's what
Joel, while we're talking about people who are full of shit, let's talk about a different community that might be surprising. Let's talk about the activist community, who I know very well. I started something called the Climate Emergency Fund with my pals Eileen Getty and Rory Kennedy, and the Climate Emergency Fund is now one of the biggest funders of the activist community. And I'm very proud of that work and the fact that they're doing that. And we need the activists, right? We absolutely need the activists out there putting pressure on government. But currently, globally, it is almost impossible to point to an example of success related to activism producing public policy change. Name a place.
That's for climate change or in general,
Climate.
any topic?
No, just climate.
Yeah,
just climate. Sorry.
specific.
Yeah. So the best thing you could probably point to would be the UK, where thanks to Extinction Rebellion and a whole bunch of other people, the parliament declared a climate emergency. So it was a national government that declared a climate emergency, which was the thesis that you declare an emergency. And then if you declare an emergency, public policy frameworks emerge around that emergency. But fast forward a couple of years past that emergency being declared, you've got the prime minister there openly supporting an expansion of North Sea drilling. You don't have any real changes in terms of public policy that are lasting in any way. And that's the best of class example we have of activism forcing government action. In this country, there have been no policy successes.
Yeah, but
Lots of marches. Everybody remember when the climate activists, some of whom I know, surrounded Joe Manchin's Maserati in DC and were banging on the hood of it and yelling at him. And Joe Manchin's response to that was, fuck you. I don't represent you. I represent the people of West Virginia. Oh, by the way, I also happen to personally make a bunch of money from coal. It's not working. And the Inflation Reduction Act, sure, it included some wonderful incentives for climate. It also, the climate tech and for climate infrastructure, it also included wonderful incentives for the oil and gas companies. And in the end, it was Joe Manchin that cut that deal with President Biden. And he did it on his own terms, and he did it in a way that he thought benefited his constituents and himself, I think. So in the world of who's full of shit, I think we also need to question what we've been told by the left on this issue. And I consider myself to be on the left, by the way. I've got all the Democratic credentials anybody could have, right? But I think that there's a real problem there. And I think the problem is in part how we're talking about it, the way we're judging people that are on the other side of the issue from us. I think there's a lot of sort of virtue signaling and judgment around people that drive pickup trucks and think of gas just as something they put in the car to go fishing or take their kids to their soccer game, that don't think of it as an evil thing. Major problem.
We've had a pretty big shift since we last talked. We pivoted 100% away from family offices, private equity, institutional groups, and we just got SEC qualification for a Regulation A offering.
Oh,
so
cool.
Our thesis, what we're testing, is sort of exactly what you're talking about. It's if you put an opportunity in front of these activists, in front of people who are frustrated by the lack of action with the climate change, and you give them an opportunity to direct or to invest directly into net zero real estate for as little as $250 and earn a 10% return, will they do it? And if it doesn't work, it's either because our marketing effort failed, which we're confident it won't, or it's because activists like to complain, but they don't really like to do anything. So I think overall, we're optimistic that it will work, but we're sort of testing out your line of questioning in real time.
I think it's really smart. I spend a lot of time in Wyoming and also in California, Southern California. I feel like I sort of touch two different worlds. And well, right now in the Central Valley of California, you have wild flooding taking place. So I don't know if you guys have followed this, but it is terrifying. And that is one of the most important agricultural regions of the world. It is a huge part of the California economy, which is already getting hit on the tech side of things and on the entertainment side of things. And when the snow melts, record snowfall up there, when the snow melts, a problem that is already huge is going to be exponential. So in end of April, May, you're going to see insane flooding in the Central Valley, which is going to lead to crop failure, which is going to lead to food inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was on a text thread with a bunch of climate-focused philanthropists the other day, and they were talking about media strategies around like how to attack the oil companies, like using Instagram or something. And I said, what you should get involved with is these farmers up north who are, and one in particular, there's an amazing video of a farmer taking I think it was a Ford F-150 pickup full of dirt and launching it off of the side of a levee that had failed to try to block the levee. If you haven't seen this video, you have to go see it. They then took a bulldozer and plowed dirt over the top of the two pickups, actually, and they saved. It was an almond grove, I think, and they saved it. I said, go talk to that guy that sacrificed his F-150 to save the farm, because that guy is on the front lines of the climate emergency. And he's talking about our food, right? And I think that's the part that traditional left-wing climate activists miss, which is that this can't just be a conversation about eating a little less meat or living a car-free lifestyle, which, by the way, is not possible for people that don't live in cities that have public transportation. And I think as long as we are sort of shouting at each other, we're not going to solve the problem on the activist side of things.
That is so near and dear to my heart. I get in these conversations all the time, and it's always about finger pointing and just blanket judging an entire side. And I mean, this is a global problem. So if you get fixated on your mushroom handbags, as you called them, and judging every single pickup driver, you're never going to break through, and it affects us all. And it's so great to hear that from you, because it really is unfortunate. I consider that I have all the prongs of a Democratic person as well, as far as the left side of the aisle, but you're not going to accomplish shit if you don't open up and try to view how this affects all of us.
I've heard it myself. I mean, I founded and I was the chairman of the Climate Emergency Fund, largest funder of activists in the world. And yet I have had climate activists say to me, how can you be a climate activist because you're a fly fisherman? Because I love the fly fish. By the way, I put all the fish back, by the way, every single one of them. It hurts their lip a little bit, but they're fine. Trust me, I see them swim away. They're perfectly fine. Because now on the left, right, we want to talk about veganism also having to be a core part of climate action. Extinction Rebellion, famously, when it came from the UK to the US, decided to embrace a whole bunch of issues beyond climate issues, and then immediately fell apart when it came to the US. I don't know if you guys know this story, But, arguably one of the more effective climate activist groups sets up shop in New York, and then right away, the New Yorkers that were organizing it said, well, we have to get into police brutality because the George Floyd stuff was going on. And the English people said, well, we all agree that police brutality is a horrible problem and that police reform needs to occur. And there's major problems with race in the United States, of course, and institutional racism, everything. We completely agree. But they said, but is the job of a climate organization to fix those things? And they said, yes, it is. Because this is the New Yorkers. They said, if we don't also address systemic racism, institutional poverty, police brutality, we can't affect a just transition and address decarbonization. So if you start deciding every person that's in the climate movement has to agree on police reform, capitalism being bad, whatever, capitalism,
you're going nowhere.
You quickly find yourself in the situation which Extinction Rebellion found themselves in the US, which is that it completely fell apart. So there was no ability outside of a group of people huddled at Union Square Park, violently agreeing with each other about how terrible global capitalism and all these issues were. It's just not going to happen. So we have to treat this with a level of seriousness that we're not treating it with. Seriousness means actually working with people that you might not like or you might disagree with. Trevor has a pickup truck and he likes to catch fish, but maybe Trevor also cares about a livable planet, right? And that those things aren't mutually exclusive. So, by the way, I'm not saying it's as purely a problem of the left. My God, the right just denies that climate even exists. It's even an issue, right? There's plenty of culpability there as well, right? Yeah. I guess my view is that we're not going to be able to change a lot of those folks. Although I think that you're seeing change happen because of math, because of job creation, and the fact that this is actually a very attractive place for people to go.
Well, Trevor, we don't have much time left, but we're segueing into something I wanted to ask about Extinction Rebellion. If you pay attention to you on LinkedIn, you post a lot about biodiversity and crises that our ecosystems are facing. So the work you're doing, I think we read Creatures United. Was that maybe to fill in where Extinction Rebellion fell short? Maybe you can expand a little bit on that work?
No, I stepped back from the Climate Emergency Fund a couple of years ago because of these issues we were talking about. I had tried to get them to engage actually hunters, anglers, people in the center. I wanted us to be talking to evangelicals, and that the organization and its current leadership was not interested in that. And so I stepped away from that. And for a long time, I have been worried separately but related about the biodiversity crisis, which is that our ecosystems, the ecosystems that sustain all life on this planet, are in the midst of collapse, scientifically demonstrable collapse. We've lost 70% of all wild animals since 1970. And wild animals are not just cute creatures that we like to look at on nature shows. They are the same ecosystem that we are a part of. And I think people don't really understand that. So I've gotten together with a group of conservation biologists led by a fascinating guy called Gerardo Ceballos, who are species extinction experts. And we are trying to educate people on species extinction in a pretty novel and disruptive way. And so you may have seen some of these creatures. There's an amazing artist, and we've used some AI to let these creatures talk. And you're going to be seeing more of it. We launched that at the Biodiversity COP in Montreal a few months ago, and it's just getting started. But for me, that is, and I think this is your point, Joel, that is a way of talking about the climate crisis to people that are not going to be motivated when hearing about parts per million of CO2 from the Mauna Loa Observatory, but might be motivated by hearing that, like in the UK, the sound of birds has changed in the UK. So when you used to be in the English countryside, you would hear certain birds and there was a sound to the place. That sound has changed. Why? You now have birds from Africa and from Spain. Other birds have moved in, and literally the sound of the countryside has changed. Things like this, I hope, can resonate with people, certain people at least, in a different way than these discussions about carbon dioxide, which is a very amorphous thing. I mean, I don't think any of us really understand what 418 parts per million of CO2 means. So I guess our hope is that by communicating to people about species extinction and the ecosystems that are suffering, because not just from global warming, but also from deforestation and water degradation, acidification of the oceans and all those things, we can create a new line of argument for people and do it on behalf of these animals, which in a certain way are almost sacred things. If we don't have that, I don't want my 3 kids to only know of wild animals because they existed in some old movie that they don't want to watch on Netflix, right? Or some picture book that makes it seem like it's this ancient thing. I want there to be wild animals in the world.
People protect what they love. And I think a lot of environmentalists become that because of some experience in nature and wildlife. So couldn't agree more.
That's exactly right.
Well, Trevor, we have a closing question we always like to end with. We talked today a lot about negativity, and of course, that's part of the narrative in the climate conversation right now. But this podcast is about hope. It's about optimism. It's about people taking action, disrupting. So let's not be negative. Maybe you can close us out with something you're hopeful about for the future.
Catastrophism is just a big excuse. Because if you're a person that can actually get out of bed every day and choose how you use your time and choose how you use your energy, you've got a choice to make. And I'll tell you a real story about this. So as the Woolsey fire was still burning in Malibu, we convened a group of people to start thinking about how to rebuild for people that couldn't afford to rebuild. And Sean Penn was there at the meeting, and he and I perhaps had a couple of glasses of tequila, and we're reflecting upon what has happened. Sean lives in Malibu, and he didn't know if his house had burned down. I didn't know if mine house had burned down. We're all evacuated. And I said, Sean, who I knew from Haiti earthquake stuff and a bunch of other stuff, man, is this the world that we're going to live in? Is there anything that actually can be done? These fires are going to come all the time. Our kids are going to, is there anything that we can do? And he said, in a typical Sean fashion, you shut the fuck up. You shut the fuck up. You're a father. And you don't have the luxury as a father of going down that road. You are going to fight. And I thought to myself, awesome. He has got a point. And so I guess that's my view is, sure, you could curl up in the fetal position and suck your thumb and say it's all too late. I'm just going to enjoy my life. That's just a big excuse. It's up to all of us if we want to fight. And I want to fight.
Yeah,
that's great. That's a perfect sentiment to end on, Trevor. This has been fascinating. There's so much more we'd love to dive into. Maybe we can have you back.
I'd love it, guys. Thanks for doing what you're doing. It's really cool, and it's something I'd love to be supportive of. So if I can ever help, let me know, and thanks for taking the time.
We will take you up on that for sure.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Our max is 75 million, so there's about 74 left. If you want to write us a check, that'd be great.
Keep rebelling. We need more rebels. And so you've got my support in your rebellion for sure.
How can we find you? How can our audience learn more about what you're working on?
I'm on Twitter. I'm there sometimes, but wastefuel.com is a good place to be, or the WasteFuel Instagram account keeps people pretty updated. So check that out.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. You can find us and most of the social media platforms at Join Rayven. That's JOIN, Rayven with a Y, RAYVEN. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinrayven.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?